Welcome to Purple Octopus. From House Studios, this is a show for discovering wholeness in a fractured world.
I'm John Buck, decision maker.
I'm Karen Gimnig, relating.
I'm Laureen Golden, developing unit.
And I'm François Knuchel, paradigm shifting.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Purple Octopus. We're so glad to be with you today. I am Karen Gimnig, and I am speaker for today as well as hosting, so I'll guide us through this process. And my talk today is really based out of a conversation Laureen and I were having the other day, and I've done sort of some more thinking about that. And it has to do with how we divide up tasks, how we organize work, and what happens with that when we reorganize ourselves in a multi-mind kind of space, in a more egalitarian kind of space. Because we grew up in these spaces where, you know, from school, there's a teacher in charge telling everybody what to do all the time. And then we have this concept of we start work and there's a boss and the boss tells us what to do. There's all this hierarchy attached to who does what. And I think there is this instinct to say, okay, well, if we're going to go into this sort of egalitarian, non-hierarchical space, that also means nobody tells anybody else what to do. And that in fact, the skill of knowing who should do what is a skill, like it's a task and it has value. And so I just want to talk through a kind of what I think happens in these spaces where we're trying to do a thing and we have to get ourselves organized to do the thing, and how we do that when most of us, what we're good at is this sort of hierarchical environment. And we said, okay, we're not going to be that. So what do we do instead? And as Laureen and I were talking, it sort of came to me this vision or image of like you've got a table with all of these tasks laid out on it, almost like each one was a block or something. Like you've got all this stuff on the table and you've got everybody around it who's part of the project. And it seems to me that the first thing that happens is that folks get aware of their own and others' skill sets, or what I will call your genius, right? And so if I'm sitting at that table, I'm going to reach for the thing that is my genius, that is the thing that I'm really good at. And if someone else also reaches for that same thing, then we sort of navigate, are we going to share it or how are we going to do that? But I think those things come off of the table pretty quickly. And I actually think groups do that really well. What's tricky is about what's left. So after everyone's picked up their genius piece, then there's these other tasks that still remain. And I think it gets tricky to figure out who's going to do those. And the piece I really am leaning into in my thinking is about how much we attach hierarchy and value to that. And particularly values around certain types of tasks being valued more highly than certain other types of tasks, or certain types of skills being valued more highly than other types of skills. And so, you know, we have this sort of bizarre thing where we value really highly the person whose job it is to do the final review of the budget. And, you know, they're super important and high in the hierarchy, but the person who cleans the toilets is menial and nobody. But I got to say, I actually care that the toilets get cleaned, right? Like that skill matters. And so just being thoughtful about how we can have those conversations to figure out who's going to pick up which pieces in a way that doesn't drag along with it the weight of hierarchy and value attached. And is there a way to sort of talk about and be transparent about all of that baggage that comes along, so that, like, I want to live in this utopian future where we don't have that baggage, right? Where all the tasks are equally valued and we just figure it out without a sense of hierarchy or without a sense of entitlement or without a sort of apologizing for wanting the good task, right? Like that we just can sort of show up as our people. I don't think I'm ever going to be capable of that, to be honest. And I suspect this is a generational thing, that my inner stories of that's a leadership task and that's a grunt task and that's I don't think those just go away. And so I feel like as we're transitioning toward a less hierarchical or a non-hierarchical way of being with each other, that it turns out to be really important to be transparent about that and to be able to say, I feel like I'm taking all the, the leader tasks, or I'm taking all the higher end tasks. Does that feel okay to other people? Like, is that really a match to what my skill set is? Or, hey, that's the thing I really want to do. I think it's just as important as the rest, but that's where I want to go. But just to be able to just be really transparent and aware of what's the baggage we're bringing along that we'd like to set aside so that we can really do this multi-mind thing. But also, how is it still showing up so that we can sort of talk through it and get really present with each other about it, and hopefully not trip over it, or at least notice when we trip over it before we totally, bang our lip or whatever. So that's what I have been thinking about. And I'm curious what the rest of you are thinking about it. John, you want to go next?
Oh, I have lots to say about that. The Greeks dealt with that back, in before Christ times, as in 500 or 600 years before Christ. When they had the masses of people getting together, they still had to have like a mayor of Athens and so forth. And so what they did is they would elect the mayor each year. And then in order for the mayor not to be like, a continuing like controller of power, you had to leave town for a year. And that was how they tried to control the tendency of somebody in a highly responsible job to not continue in that job. I think that it's more of a both and kind of a situation where you do need hierarchy, because the nature of work is such that you have very abstract work and it gets broken down into more and more detailed stuff. And that's where the cleaning the toilets is, and approving the budget is kind of much more abstract. And the power of all of us to be completely equal and assign who do we want to have cover what pieces of the hierarchy maintains our equivalence. Getting rid of the hierarchy, I don't think is functional. It just, that doesn't work. And it's the ability to not have it, to elect people or to assign power for a limited period of time, and maybe allow that to be repeated, but not always, and worrying and having new people coming in, so that actually, if you're leading a bunch of leaders, it's much easier to lead because they know what you're doing, and people can easily give back and forth the power of doing things. So I think that's the trick, is how do we maintain sovereignty over our own power and not allow it to be snatched away by manipulators or big ego people and so forth. It's sort of like, how do we make it the rule by law as opposed to the rule by people? And so we have to set up our own local laws, our own local processes. I'm done. You're muted, Karen.
Laureen, you're next.
I'm really glad you brought this back to this circle, like to think this through from a multi-mind lens. I think what was coming up, and then John, you're adding your perspective to it. I think for me, there is something around Rion Eisler, and she talked about hierarchies of actualization versus hierarchies of domination. But like even in nature, we have hierarchies. And John, I feel like that's what you're kind of naming, that like, abstract to detail. And so don't necessarily lose track of that. And so some of it, Karen, that's coming up for me is like a lot of this is around power and values. And John, you started tapping into the thing of power. And, Bernadette, a lot of people are talking right now about power requires power within, and the ways that we give away our power. And also that we snatch away. I mean, in some ways, like I always think of it as like some evil person trying to snatch away my power, but I do think, and this, Karen, this is to me what came up, but like our unconsciousness around that we did grow up in a power over power underworld. And it's just so embodied, like it's in all cells of our body, like this thing of powerlessness and someone coming in and, taking away my moment to do something when I'm really little. And so, Karen, I'm hearing you inviting us to a greater sense of consciousness over power, and also values we assigned, that like that the old world really had some things were, I mean, power over, power under, things were elevated and things were diminished, like they were devalued. And how do I carry that forward is very like, so just, and then the last thing that I heard you saying, Karen, is just like, this is tracked, you know, it's something that as individuals we're trying to become more conscious of, but as multi-minds, as groups, it's something we help each other notice. Because sometimes, you know, I love this thing so, but like my underwear is showing, but it's showing in a way that I can't see without someone else giving me a mirror. Like, and so it is through our collective work together that I think we bump up against things that we're not seeing without each other as mirrors. So thank you.
François.
Thank you. So first of all, I think there's a distinction between power and the abuse of power. And what I was hearing from what you were saying, Karen, I got more of a sense that the problem was with the abuse of power and the violence rather than hierarchy per se. And you can have power and misuse of power without hierarchy. You know, we call them bullies, and of course when you have that, which is then combined with hierarchy, then that really becomes very toxic. But it's not hierarchy per se, which is a fault, because the ability to order things in different sort of categories, taxonomy, and so on, happens in nature, as we've said, as you said. First of all, so power is more the problem or the challenging issue rather than hierarchy, in my view. The key word, one of the key words you said, Karen, I think, was transparency. So that wherever we have to organize and self-organize, whichever way we do, the key point is being transparent about it. So that and transparent so that we can challenge each other. And that challenge is not meant as a personal attack, but challenge is mainly just to sort of redress things if sometimes, because sometimes things don't quite go quite right. But just having the ability to address that and redress that, then I think that's the important thing. Also, one thing that's often not talked about when we talk about hierarchy is we just assume that hierarchy is something static. But in my view, that's not static at all. The hierarchy has to be adapted to the circumstances. So if we do create a hierarchy for whatever reason, because that's a practical thing to do, that shouldn't become something permanent. That's just created for the particular circumstances we created it for, and therefore if we move on, we need to have that ability to change the hierarchy, and so to change the structure of that hierarchy. So that means both the structure of the hierarchy as well as the people within the hierarchy who's doing what. It's a combination of both, so the ability to modify the hierarchy. And in that respect, one of the key things that I really learned from, which I think was really vital that I learned from John Edwin, actually, in that where you also have hierarchies. You got the neighborhood, so the children or the neighborhood, then you've got you've got several neighbors that have together, so you have to, by definition, almost you have a representative for the neighborhood and another one for the next neighborhood. By definition it becomes a hierarchy. But the key thing, first of all, is come from the ground up rather than come from the top down. That's the one key point. But the other key element that John Edwin has built in, which I think, for example, something like sociocracy hasn't built in, is the ability to recall. In other words, if the people, if the neighborhood are not satisfied and don't feel that the rep they've elected is really representing them, then they've got the ability to recall, so it doesn't become a permanent thing where power can just be gradually taken over, which is what invariably always happens, or in most situations. So that ability to recall, I think, is for me actually a very important point. I'll stop there. I could go on.
Yes, thanks, François. It sounds like we have lots of ideas about all of this. Yeah, I'm interested. I tend to think in the small group realm of the, the 10, 20 people kind of realm, and John and François are both sort of reaching to like larger governance, which I think is lovely. And I think it speaks to where we need sort of both the relationship lens that I tend to function from, but also looking at structures and how to structure. So to Francois's point of that ability to recall, when I think of that from a relational lens, the way I would think to frame it is that leadership from or hierarchy from a point of dominance or power over or mandatory, like instructional dictatorship kind of hierarchy, I think is where it's problematic. I think of invitational leadership, of if I'm the person, and this is my lived experience, because it is often true that I'm the person in the room that has the skill to say, oh, we've got all these things and we've got these people, and if we match this person to this thing, and we can get it all organized and off we go. Or even I think of the classic sort of, where are we going to go for dinner? Like, I'm often the one who can sort of pull what I'm hearing everybody say and say, this is the place that will work for everyone. And if I do that from a place of, okay, I've got it figured out, you all have to do what I say now, because I know, or because I'm the boss, or because whatever power I bring with that, then that's problematic, because it doesn't, to Francois's point, have that ability to recall, right? There's not the humility of I might be getting it wrong, and there's not the empowerment of everyone to notice if I'm getting it wrong. But if I do exactly the same thing from a place of invitation and say, this is what I'm hearing, with a little more transparency about how I got there probably, and this is the suggestion, and it is that place of invitation, of suggestion, it can be exactly the same organizational skill, but the tone and the way in which it's done, which in a smaller place where we can be more casual with our structures, it is just literally the space of, hey, wait, no, that doesn't work. But it is that ability to recall. It's the ability to say, okay, that we've got something on the table, seems like a good idea. We've made use of the skill set in the room, and there's absolute permission to recall it. And I think what Laureen was leaning into is that even when that permission is there and explicit, it's not always received. We don't always tell ourselves we have the permission because we're not used to having it. And so I think there's this sort of huge both end of culture shift that we're trying to work toward, that then will support the structures as well, right? Like at the larger and larger scale. But to get to a place of, it really is that sort of feedback loop, that checking in, and it comes down to trust of, do we trust each other enough? Do we feel safe enough? And particularly if we are what I would think of as a transitional generation between what's been and where we're headed, those of us in that transitional space we're gonna stub our toes. We're not gonna do it right. And we're gonna be battling those internal stories of, this is not how I learned to do this thing. This was not what I learned was okay in social settings. This is not, and I think we have to be able to talk about those and check in, and I think we'll probably over check in, like, really, is it okay? And really you're not upset with me about this? Like, can we, and some of that's just going to be there. And I think we have to be conscious of that baggage. And I imagine that over decades, as we move this way, that some of that it won't need to be as explicit, because we just know, of course I can say I don't like the thing you said to me or what you suggested. Of course it was just a suggestion as opposed to a dictate. So yeah, so I think the way the power is being held is really essential. So I'm just watching our time, and I think we have time for another round if we're shorter. So this is sort of the final thoughts round. John.
Yes. Related to recall is performance review. Usually we think of performance review as something coming from the top down, but it can also come from the top and the bottom and the side, and a tradition of saying, hey, I need to check with everybody, how am I doing with that? Or to say, you know, I'm feeling like I'm uncomfortable with what's happening. Let's do a bit of review around this. Maybe we've got the role assigned wrong, whatever, but to be able to actually measure that and get data makes the recall a lot more efficient, and also helps people grow a lot, and catches people who are playing with power inappropriately, helping them not, you know, scratch those matches in the dry tinder. Thoughts? That's all.
Thanks, Jen. Laureen.
All right. On the quick note, I think the thing that's standing out for me the most is around learning, because I feel like both you and John have mentioned it in this, but just you know, that feedback loop of doing and then getting feedback in and then reflecting and like just doing it slightly different. But we are a transition. I love that naming of that we're a transitional generation. I would just name quickly embodied trauma. You know, I'm reading my grandmother's hands, and just how much of this lives not in just we can make a commitment in our intellect, but to be able to do it differently, and, you know, or just to be aware when my body tenses up around me speaking up or something. I just think bringing the body online is really important for this to really make a difference.
François.
Yes, so first of all, I just want to correct myself. I talked about John Edwin before. It's actually the wrong way around. His name is Edwin John. So I just want to make that correction, which is a bit confusing because John is normally a first name. So so it's Edwin John. You mentioned the word trust, Karen, and which sort of sparked in me sort of, yes, so how do you, the question is, how do you achieve, or how do you get to a position of trust? And of course there's a trust, there are various kinds of trust. There's trust in each other, but there's also trust that nothing untoward will happen, so that's more in a sense of safety, feeling safe. So it's very difficult for people to be transparent, for example, if they feel that they're going to be repercussions as to what they say. So there's trust and transparency are easy to say, but it's actually not quite that easy to implement, because there's a whole set of issues or challenges behind it. It's also trusting in human nature is another thing, because we have certainly in the West we have a tendency to distrust others, and that's what comes about and brings about this feeling of needing to control or something. That's another element. And but again, coming back to the repercussions, a lot of the ways that we act, and I think so. Trust doesn't just come by trusting. There are certain behaviors, there are certain things we do that either promote or discourage trust, and most of the kind of ways we talk to each other tend to discourage trust. To put it very simply, because a lot of it is and that's the way we were brought up to, we're in battle with everybody else, who is a very much adversarial approach, and therefore that's where you get in organizations things like backstabbing and so on, and what really destroys trust, but you can have sort of at the front you can have a collegial very sort of trusting sort of environment, and yet at the back other things are happening, like the backstabbing or other things which fundamentally, and I'd like to bring in the word undermine the relationship, and the undermining, and a lot of our behaviors and the way we were taught to behave have actually an undermining effect, because when you're undermined, that sort of everything falls from under your feet, basically, at the extreme level. So we need to look at what are those behaviors and what are the particular conditions that create either an adversarial undermining sort of perspective, or what are the ones that sort of encourage us to move forward in a more trusting way. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, the word that I think John may have said, or maybe it just came up for me as he was talking, but I think it fits with François' things as well, and some of what Laureen was saying is intent. And I think one of the sort of old world culture pieces that I hope we are moving away from is the belief that I can know your intent and that I can judge your behavior based on my understanding of your intent. And I think it plays into recall, like, you did a thing that impacted me badly, therefore you must have intended to hurt me and you should be out of that position, as opposed to the kind of review that John was recommending, where we actually just have a conversation and can give the feedback of this negative impact happened on me. Where do we go with that? And I think that this is a place where the trust piece really fits, is that we want to put together all the factors, as François, you were talking about. It's not just as simple as a word, but if we can begin to trust that the intent was positive, that we're holding good intent for one another, and get curious about what were the impacts and why, and how did I have such a negative impact when the intent was good, that from there we can build a lot of the rest of what all of us have been talking about. But I think really tracking our tendency to think that the thing that happened to me must be the thing that was intended by the person who did it, and that's almost never true. And I think, François, to your point about the trust of human nature, I think that's one of the fundamental stories we tell ourselves that's just not true, is that it is human nature to go out and hurt other people. And I think that's not true. I think we often do things that hurt other people, but I don't think that's because it's what we start out the day thinking we're wanting to do. I think when people are getting hurt, it's because something else is going amiss, other than something as simple as it's human nature to hurt people. So yeah, so I think it's interesting to track, and so many ideas. I do want to bring us to a close on time here. So I'm really just tracking from everybody this, as we move into new ways of distributing tasks and leadership and roles, to not throw out hierarchy, but to be much, much more careful of tracking power and where it's landing, and whether the division of labor and the division of power is working for us and for all of us. So I think that's our round. Thank you, everybody.